itself, so intrinsic teleology. That's the distinction that Hegel draws. He does it in a couple of different ways. He calls it extrinsic to intrinsic teleology, calls it subjective purpose to objective purpose, right? It's all talking about the same thing. So I want to come back and try to work through that last paragraph or so in the teleology section for that reason. There's another issue that I'm going to mention here. When he makes that transition, he says, now we've reached the concept as adequate concept. Right? This is what he calls the idea. It's this definition of the idea is the adequate concept. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about what the idea is and what it isn't today. But I won't talk about what it means to the adequate concept, because I want to reserve that for next time, right? So next time I'm going to talk about the notion of truth, which is what adequate concept really is ultimately about. It's about truth. So we'll come back and talk about the notion of truth next week. So just get ready for that then. And what is Hegel's conception of truth? Yeah, we'll talk about that next week a bit too. All right, let's preview things you want to ask me about, problems or issues. If you haven't started working on your paper, do so, right? Many of you have come to talk to me already about your papers. I appreciate that, and I don't require that, but if you want to come talk to me, I'll be glad to meet with you either via Zoom or in my office hours. Otherwise, get to work on them because we are now in, my lecture notes tell me, week 7, right? And the paper is due by the 26th of March. So we're about, roughly a month away. Sounds a lot longer away than it actually is. Sounds further away than it actually is. So get to work is my sort of standard thing to mention at this point. And a lot of you will ask me, what should I write on? I have a fairly simple answer to that, and that is something related to the logic, obviously. And there's 800 pages, so you ought to find something you can write on between those pages. But I will say one thing in addition to that. I think I've said this before, but let me just reiterate it. And that is, I think of this thematic paper, which does require secondary sources, right? So that's how it's different, one of the ways in which it's different than the exegetical paper. You can use your exegetical paper and build on it and write your thematic paper out of that if you'd like. But the real usage of this thematic paper is to dive down deep into something that you found interesting but are unsure about, right? And you want to learn more about. Think of the thematic paper not as something you're writing as a kind of preparation to go to a conference or submit to a journal. That's really not the purpose at this point. The purpose here is just really to dive down deeper into something that you found interesting, confusing, perplexing, and want to explore in more detail. Go look at the secondary literature on, you get a sense of where the debates are about it, and then come to some kind of set of resolution about it perhaps, or even more typically, come to formulate your own questions about it. I'm quite happy if you write me a thematic paper, and the end of that thematic paper, the glorious conclusion, right, of the thematic paper is a set of questions that you think, need to be posed and addressed in further research, right? That's a fantastic thematic paper as far as I'm concerned, because at that point, you've learned more stuff than you just would have learned by simply going through the material in lectures like we do. But also you've explored it a bit on your own, and you've come to formulate some questions on your own that you would want to explore in the future. You might do so, you might not, but that's really a good use of the thematic paper that I'm having you do that. So don't feel like you need to come to a conclusion, okay, in the standard sense of a thesis that you are arguing for is definitively now solving this exegetical or philosophical problem. That's not really what I think these thematic papers as being. Lower the temperature, lower the I don't want to say lower the ambition because that sounds wrong to me, but don't try to reach for definitive resolution of all things. I'm quite happy to see you tackle these issues and come out with honest, here's what's at stake type of questions on the other side. I'd love to see that. Make sense? As long as it's related to the logic, we're good in terms of topics and things like that. All right. So let's talk then about the transition from teleology into to life. But I want to go back up to do that. I'm sorry to keep doing this, but I really do think this is a momentous point in the logic, so it's worth doing this. I want to do that by talking about the transition into teleology and then talking about teleology again for just a moment, because we talked about that only at the end of class last time. So I apologize for this, what I'm about to do, but it's what I've done repeatedly, and so I'm going to repeat it one more time. And then I'm going to come back to this passage on 527. We've been here 1,000 times at this point, I'm sick of it. So I understand that. But I do think it's worth coming to this point again. So this is midway down the page on 527, this is page 30 in the German. And he's telling us what's going on in the objectivity chapter. And this is this initial kind of, what in the hell does that mean? Right? And now hopefully, once we've been through this, we have a little bit of a sense of what it might mean. So he says there, one with the matter at issue, it, the concept, what he's talking about, the concept, is submerged, is literally sunk into it. It's sunk into the matter at issue, objectivity. Its differences are objective determinations of existence. So the differences of the concept, universality, particularity, singularity, and its judgmental structure and its logistic structure. They're objective determinations of existence in which it is itself, again, the inner. So it's buried within it. It's the soul, he's about to call it that, of objectivity itself. As the soul of objective existence, it, he's still talking about the concept, must give itself the form of subjectivity. Well, didn't already have that. Yes, but it didn't have it in objectivity itself. So he says, it must give itself the form of subjectivity that it immediately had as formal concept. So yeah, it's already had it. That's what subjectivity chapter was doing. And so in the form of the free concept, which in objectivity it still lacked, it steps forth over against objectivity. The concept now steps over against objectivity. And over against it, it makes therein the identity with it, an identity with objectivity itself, which as objective concept it has in and for itself, also into an identity that is also positive. So it renders that now explicit. What it had already, we saw in, the concept has already in subjectivity, it has to bear that out in objectivity itself. And it does that by this moment of becoming other than objectivity, rendering objectivity a mere immediate existence, and then making of that objectivity something that is for its use. That's what external teleology is, right? It is where objectivity is now at the behest of, and does the bidding of, we could say, at least that's the plan, of the realization of the concept, right? The realization of the concept. So there are three claims. I've said this several times, so I just want to come back and reiterate this and then build on it a bit. There are three claims that Hegel's making about the account then of objectivity. He's saying that the status of the concept in objectivity is that of submergence. It's constricted, it's unfree there, at least initially. That's the first claim. The second claim he makes there is that, well, then we see the necessity of what's going on here as the necessity of the concept coming to be itself in and through objectivity. Now, it was already itself at the formal level, right? The syllogistic structures gave us that. But now we need to see that borne out in objectivity itself. So there's a necessity of what he calls here the restoring of freedom to the concept in objectivity. And then finally, the third claim is that the process of becoming free happens in and through objectivity, not just over against it. It's not like, right, the concept has delivered itself from objectivity, stands out over against it, is finally emancipated from it, is free on its own. That's precisely not what Hegel's saying. Hegel's saying it frees itself from objectivity. Yes, that happens in the moment at the end of chemism. We'll revisit that just a second one more time, maybe one last time. It happens there, but it comes to be free, self-determining, self-generating, self-causing, only at the moment where objectivity itself is now one with it and is made possible through in and through its process itself, which is then the transition not from chemism to teleology, but the transition from teleology to life. Life is that moment where the concept comes to be fully and completely free in and through itself, because it's free in and through objectivity itself, because it's in objectivity itself, but not submerged. So we know the distinction that Hegel draws between objectivity as in and for itself and immediate existence. And we know that the chapter of objectivity works on, the section on objectivity works on that distinction of initially chemism and mechanism are all about objectivity in and for itself. And then at the end of chemism, the concept then becomes differentiated from objectivity itself. And that means that objectivity now is no longer being in and for itself. It is immediate existence, and immediate existence for the sake of the concept, right? For the sake of the concept. So when he says at the end of chemism that that the concept has now become differentiated and freed itself from objectivity, so that it stands over against it, over relationship to it, that's what he's talking about. So remember there that he says, I'm quoting from page 649 now. I'm throwing you over 100 pages, I apologize, but 649 now, the first 6 lines of that page. This is in 151 and 152 in the German. He says, consequently, on the one hand, chemism has gone back to its beginning. So once we see it, the concept is what generates the movement of chemism itself, right? This chemical process that is going into neutralization, but always disrupting that neutralization and coming back out of that neutralization. So coming together and also separating apart, disrupting. So we get back and we see, oh, here's how objects qua chemical are actually standing in tensed intrinsic relationship with one another. He says, in that sense, chemism has gone back to its beginning, in which objects in a state of reciprocal tension seek one another. They have affinity for one another, as he puts it, and then combine in a neutral product by means of a formal and external middle term. So yeah, that's how we get that. That's how the chemical, the chemism of the world takes place. But on the other hand, he says, by thus going back to its concept, so now the concept has arisen, right? The concept is this, what initially looked like the center of the mechanical, the law of the mechanical, which turned out to be empty. The law is just the law of that process of coming together and going apart in the mechanical sense, which is all extrinsic. Here now we have that coming together, neutralization and disrupting, being done ultimately by the concept itself. The concept is proven to be that, not the objects. Right? So the process is not the objects, it's not in the objects. That's the initial account of it, but it proves out to be something more than the objects. Is the concept that then stands out over against them. And he says, and on the other hand, by thus going back to its concept, chemism sublates itself, takes up and cancels itself, and has gone over into a higher sphere. That higher sphere, of course, is teleology. Why? Because the relationship between the concept and objectivity, you could say, broadly speaking, the relationship between the concept and mechanism and chemism, as the totality of objectivity itself, is now one of extrinsic teleology. Okay? So he says there on 649, this is right at the beginning of the second full paragraph on 649, he says, chemism is itself the first negation of the indifferent objectivity and of the externality of determinations. It is still burdened, therefore, by the immediate self-subsistence of the object and with externality. Consequently, it is not yet for itself that totality of self-determinations that proceeds from it and in which it is rather sublated. So we haven't gotten to the full freedom of the concept. Right? Now, the task then of the teleology section is precisely to work through that relationship, that, as we saw last time, extrinsic relationship between the concept and objectivity itself. So the hallmark of objectivity at this point is that it's immediate existence, but it's immediate existence with the status of being for the sake of the concept. So Hegel will portray this, right? He will say at this point, when the concept realizes itself, the concept as purpose now, as Zweck, realizes itself, it realizes itself, tries to realize itself in and through objectivity. To do that, it needs a means through which it can achieve that. That's what objectivity is. It's the means by which it will do that. So both chemism and mechanism, those layers of objectivity, are the dimensions in which and through which the concept is to realize itself. To realize itself then means to make the concept fully objective, fully universal. So the fundamental structure, right, of external teleology is SPU, where you have this is purpose. Hegel calls it subjective purpose. This is the means. And here's the realization of it, what he calls objective purpose, or purpose realized. So you can think about it, we're going from here's where the concept is, making use of objectivity in both its mechanism and chemistic dimensions, to bring about its own realization, the concept now rendered as objective concept. That's the underlying or the fundamental problematic of extrinsic teleology. How can the concept realize itself and make of itself objective in and through objectivity itself? Hegel's point about this is that that's set up initially as a first form of all the syllogisms, right? All the syllogisms work with singularity, particularity, universality as their first form, whether we're talking about the syllogisms of existence, talking about the syllogism of reflection, syllogism of necessity. They all work with that SPU formulation as their way they're set up. And that means, as we know, in each one of those cases, though in different ways with each one, it means that S and P and U are distinct from one another. And, or better said, S and U are distinct from one another. They've got to be brought together through the middle term. The middle term is particularity here. And the particularity here is the world as chemically and mechanistically determined. That's the problematic of extrinsic teleology. And in that, under that formulation, which is not going to be how things end up, right? So let's caution ourselves and remind ourselves of that. But the way it's initially set up is to say, oh, then everything is instrumental for the realization, the fulfillment, the actualization, if you want to use that language for it, of the concept. Literally everything. Everything that exists, insofar as it exists at all, is at the behest of the concept and its realization. So everything becomes fully and completely instrumentalized. Everything becomes fully and completely expedient for the realization of the concept. Now, Hegel says then that means at that point that the relationship of the concept to universality, the concept to the world and its realization in objectivity, the world, is one of violence. It imposes itself on that which is other than it. The concept imposes itself on, this is where you get this notion of the cunning of reason, right? It's impositional, it's violence, it's cabal. The concept imposes itself, foists itself upon objectivity. Now, Hegel then makes the argument that for that even to be possible, objectivity has got to be, as he says, amenable to, right, to the concept. If it can't take the concept on, then it can't allow that to actually fulfill that. So there has to be a designedness, a purposiveness, Zweckmäßigkeit, as he's doing here, to use the Kantian third critique language. Everything in the objectivity has to be open to that possibility, has to be amenable to that. But even if that's the case, so notice, once you've made that claim, that the means to achieve the fulfillment of the concept, the realization of the concept, the particularity, mechanism and chemism, has to be amenable to the concept, is just the claim that it's open to that possibility, it's open to that realization. It would allow that to take place. But even when you make the move to say, okay, now what would that actually entail? Hegel says, well, here's where you have a problem. You have a problem because either you're going to reduce objectivity back to whatever the concept is, and it's going to be completely and fully subsumed within it. It's going to be just a feature of it. And that's going to take, obviously, a mediator for that to take place. There has to be some means for that to take place. Well, if there's another means for the means, then there's another means for the means, and you have an infinite regress opening up there. Reduction of objectivity to subjectivity, if you want to put it in those terms, of the objectivity to the concept. But you can go the reverse way. You can say, oh, well, we'll just take the concept and say it's realized out in the world. Okay, well, there's a means to do that, some instrument, some tool to bring that about. But then for that to take place, there has to be another one to make that take place, and another one to make that take place, and so on. Infinite regress, progress, you want to put it that way, goes that direction. So you have spurious infinity either way. Having said that, then Hegel makes this declaration, this one that we looked at last time, that I think is fairly stunning, but it's, bears the weight of everything he wants to do here. He says this. This is on page 666 to 667, bottom of 666. And here's where Hegel says, look, the reason why you get spurious infinity either direction is because you think of that SPU as the S and the U are separate, extrinsic to one another. And the question is, what do I have to go through? What particularity do I have to go through in order to get universality realized, to get the concept realized in universality? And he says this about that. This is under 3. We did this at the end of class last time. That's the last 4 lines on page 666. The result now is that external purposiveness, which only has so far the form of teleology, only goes so far as to be a means, not to be an objective purpose. Here's the problem, right? It's reductive. It's reductive either back to the subject, back to the concept, then the concept's not truly realized, or the concept is fully and completely equated with objectivity, but then it's not the concept that's realized, the concept's been reduced to objectivity. It's not an objective purpose because subjective purpose remains an external subjective determination. It's extrinsic, it remains something other than objectivity. It stands still out over against, like it came to be in chemism, it still stands out over against them. He then says, or insofar as purpose, in fact, is active and attains completion, albeit only in a means, and then a further means and a further means, there's your infinite progress again. It is still bound up with objectivity immediately. It is sunk into it. But there's that line again, right? All the way back from 100 and whatever pages earlier, where he's saying it's still sunk in it, right? Either way, it's still going to be, it's not going to be free in it. It's going to be submerged in it. But then look at what he says, this next perplexing key line. That purpose is itself an object. And as one may say, it does not attain a means because its realization is needed before such a realization can be brought about through a means. Read that again, because that's, Hegel says a lot of paradoxical things. Here's one of them. Purpose is itself an object. No, it's not. It's subjective in this sense. It's singular in this. It's not yet universal. Wait, he says. Purpose is itself an object. And as one may say, it does not attain a means. It doesn't attain a means. Why? Because it's not extrinsic to it. It doesn't attain a means because it's realization. So it's realization, that's what we're after, right? That's what that is. That's what extrinsic teleology is supposed to be all about, the realization of the concept in and through objectivity. Its realization is needed before such a realization can be brought about through a means. In other words, Hegel's making this claim, as I read him, and we'll look at the next paragraph and talk about that the only way this can work, the only way extrinsic teleology can do what it's supposed to do, work from the subjective purpose through a means to realization in objective existence as universality. The only way this can work is if it's made possible through this. The universality has to differentiate itself into the singularity and the particularity. In other words, this first figure of the syllogism is made possible by the third figure of the syllogism, where the third figure is not inherence. It's not the inherence of universality in singularity and particularity. This is not subsumption. This is not the subsumption of singularity and particularity under universality. It is the disjunction of, the realization of, the production of, the determination of, both of those other two moments as moments of it. The middle term has to be universality. The realization has always already taken place. That's the only way in which this relationship can actually occur. So I read that line as saying the condition of the possibility of the realization of the concept in objectivity is if objectivity and the concept both come from the same process. Then, of course, he says in the next paragraph, I say of course as though it's obvious, it's not obvious, but look at what he says in the next paragraph that I think follows directly from that. He says, but the result is in fact not only an external purposive connection. The key notion there is external, right? As we said last class, what he thinks wrong with extrinsic teleology, external teleology, extrinsic teleology, is the extrinsicality of it. That you have to go from the concept over to this thing called objectivity, and by virtue of that, get to universality. The only way that's ever going to work is if it's not an extrinsic relation in the first place. So he says. But the result is in fact not only an external purposive connection, but the truth of such a connection. What's that? He says, inner purposive connection and an objective purpose. Where'd that happen? Look at, follow on. The self-subsistence of the object over against the concept that purpose presupposes is posited in this presupposition as an unessential reflected shine and is already sublated in and for itself. The activity of the purpose truly is therefore only the exposure of this reflective shine and the sublation of it. In other words, this process has already gone on, right? The determination of the concept and objectivity is the movement of the concept itself. Both of them are exactly that. That's all they ever have been and all they ever will be. So he says, as the concept has demonstrated, the first object becomes, so the first object is objectivity, right? Immediate existence. It becomes, brought about by virtue of communication, a means. So already that's generated. What did that? What's communication? Well, if you look back in mechanism, it's the center in the law. There is no actual central object there. It's just the law. And then that proves out to be in chemism, not just a law, but an actual activity of the concept itself that does that. So he says, as the concept is demonstrated, the first object becomes by virtue of communication a means, for it implicitly in itself is the totality of the concept and its determinateness, which is none other than the externality itself, is posited as something only external and unessential, is posited in purpose itself, therefore as the latter's own moment, not as anything that stands on its own over against it. So the whole setup is a mistake. Well, mistake's a bit much, right? It's not a mistake. It's that relationship formulated purely on its own leads inevitably to spurious infinity. There's no way to get out of it, right? How do you, I mean, this is the conundrum, right, that he's showing you. It's a real conundrum. It's really there. It's always with Hegel, right? Spurious infinity is not an understanding mistake. The understanding mistake is to glob onto that and say, that's all there is. There's a contradiction here. How we can never realize this two together. Because either one's going to be reduced to the first, or the first is going to be reduced to the last, and so it's all going to be over. We can't ever get it to really happen. There's the conundrum. We can never get beyond that. That's the understanding, is holding on to spurious infinity as the ultimate truth of all things. But that doesn't deny, as we've said many, many times, that there is these infinity relations. They are there to be had. So it's not a mistake in the sense of, we've gone down the wrong path. No, we've gone down the path that's necessitated by the conceptual unfolding, but also down that path. This is what the third moment here is trying to say. Also down that path is the recognition that this differentiation of concept and objectivity is itself a product of the same process that brought both about. So they're not a bridge to be crossed over. The mediating term is not particularity, and we have to figure out which particular can be addressed by which singular, get it to be universal, or which universal addressed by which particular, those kinds of conundrums. What we need to realize is that universality produces both. So that's why he can say, therefore, as the latter's own moment, as belonging to the Zvek, as its own moment, it's belonging to it. It's not extrinsic to it. Objectivity belongs to it. It is. Not as anything that stands on its own over against it. As a result, the determination of the object as a means is altogether immediate. Now, that to Hegel is the key moment, right? Usually we would love to think of Hegel as a thinker of mediation. Yes, right? And we're right to do so. And he's all the time telling us, what looks to be immediate is actually mediated, right? You thought you had this thing right in front of you, you don't have this thing right in front of you. You thought you had this concept, nope, it's always tangled up with this other concept. So there's always mediation, confounding your immediacies. But Hegel here is saying, no, this relationship is a relationship that's been produced. The relationship between the concept and objectivity is a relationship that's been produced. That extrinsicality is secondary to the immediacy of this production of objectivity in and through the concept. So as he says here, the determination of the object as a means, so as being available for the concept, is immediate. It's what's done by the concept as law, as concept in chemism itself. So he says, there is no need, therefore. So now he's going to come back to this initial setup of extrinsicality and the violence, right, of the imposition of the concept on objectivity that is entailed by that. So he says, we saw last time, there is no need, therefore, for the subjective purpose to exercise any violence, any gevalt, to make the object into a means. You don't have to make it into a means. It's already that. Right? That's already been done. It's already ripe and ready that way, because it is the production of the concept itself. So no violence to make the object into a means, no need of extra reinforcement. The resolution, the resolve, this determination of itself is the only posited externality of the object, which is therein immediately subjected to purpose and has no other determination as against it than that of the nothingness of the being in and for itself. That's all it is. It's just the nothingness of being in and for itself. That's what it is to be produced by the concept. Yeah.
I'm having difficulty on understanding how differentiation is used both a method and a thing to be explored. If the means that you were talking about, the fact that it's productivity is not needed, but it's already there.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see that it explains differentiations, this double role.
Yeah.
Still,
So the confusion might be of my doing. So let me try to elaborate this more carefully. So the thing I want to go back to is I want to go back to two claims that Hegel's making. One claim he's making is what is initially formulated as extrinsic to one another, the concept and objectivity, proves out to not be simply and utterly external to one another. That's the first one. So that's what I take in as when he says the truth of such a connection of external proposiveness is that it's internal. That's that moment, right? He's making that claim. The second claim he's making is, but if it's set up that way, there's not that's false. It's real. So there is validity to say, there's truth in saying the concept is other than mechanism and chemistry. That the world is mechanistic and chemistic, it's other than that. There is validity, truth in saying. But that's not the ultimate truth of the matter itself. Right? So but that second claim is that there's truth to that, then it follows from that you could focus just on that. Just like we saw at the end of universality particularizes itself into singularity, and that becomes rigid and focused, and fixed. You can focus just on that. And the understanding does exactly that. So here's where the explanation comes into it, right? So the ontology is there to allow an explanation to be that kind of explanation, to be an explanation of fixed, rigid, separated, external, how do these things get together issues. That's what the understanding, the Verstand, focuses on. It's a real ontological structure, what I want to hold on. It's not a mistake. It's not an illusion. We've been here before, right? So we've seen this in the logic of being, seen it again in the logic of essence, here you see it in the logic of the concept, where there's a structure that's not ultimately proving out to be the truth of the matter, but that doesn't mean that it's false in and of itself. It's really there. So you could talk about, in this initial structure, the SPU structure, you can talk about how universality needs to be reduced to subject singularity, right? It's identified purely with the concept. Or you can do the reverse. The concept needs to be fully identified with universality. What happens in both of those is a reduction of each side, and that is going to require a means to have that take place, so you get spurious infinity either way. Those are real structures. Right? Those are real structures. But they're all predicated on the extrinsicality, the ontology being purely one of extrinsicality. Hegel's point is that the ontology is that, but that's not the ultimate truth of what's going on. Yeah? So the claim about that the external proposiveness, the ultimate truth of the external proposiveness is internal proposiveness, which is the claim he's making at the top of this paragraph, is to really show that, it not only, let me formulate it this way. Intrinsic teleology is the truth of extrinsic teleology, because it's what follows from extrinsic teleology necessarily. You couldn't have extrinsic teleology without it. And one of the things that means is the extrinsic teleology relationship is a relationship that is constituted, produced, made possible by something that it itself is not. Right? The SUP is making possible the SPU. What that really means is that the process makes possible this extrinsic relation. The process of the concept makes possible the extrinsic relation between the concept and objectivity itself. That's why no violence is necessary. Because objectivity is itself always already the concept. It's not the concept as extrinsic from it, but now in being extrinsic from it, it just is nothing other than the concept itself. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, John.
So just on that again, is it that violence is necessary, or that violence then is impossible in a certain sense? Like
Is it possible? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes any sense, but in the sense that there's never violence being done on this most basic ontological level.
So I want to cheat in answering that. I want to say yes and no, right? I feel like that's a cheat. It is a violence at one level, right? If it is the case, and it is the case, that the concept stands over against objectivity, then the concept realizing itself in objectivity, predicated on that extrinsic relationship, either reducing the world to itself or itself to the world, reducing objectivity to itself or itself to objectivity, is going to be a violent reduction either way. So these spurious infinities are violent.
Sure.
And those are real, right? They're not just fabrications of the understanding. These are actually real out there in the world. So we can speak about violence in that sense going on there. But your point, right, is, well, is that real violence? Because the reductions either way, or any of that relationship, the whole relationality of the whole thing is made possible by the movement of the concept itself, right? The process of the concept. So is it really violence at the fundamental level? Answer, no, right? What is it? It's mocked, it's not Gewalt. It's the power of the concept realizing itself in and through the world.
And that goes then to his much earlier description of free love.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's what that whole thing, he was trying to elaborate there in what I call figurative language. Here you're seeing it borne out at the more concrete level, where he's talking about it now as, well, here's what it means for the concept to be free, not just over against objectivity, but in and through objectivity, because it literally produces objectivity from itself as immanent within objectivity, not over against it. So this isn't our favorite idea of God and the world, right? God made the world over there, and then God went off and did whatever God does, and then the world went to hell, and God showed back up and said, oh, wait a minute. That's the kind of the theist version of what happened with God and the world. But this is that the concept is not over and against objectivity, it's in objectivity, and because it's in objectivity, it produces objectivity. Now, we'll talk about how it's differently situated here, right? It was, as he says, buried and submerged in objectivity initially. Now it's come out of it, sets itself over against it, proves that the only way it can actually realize itself is if it's already produced objectivity. But that means its status now vis-a-vis objectivity is not extrinsic to objectivity, nor buried within it, but free in and through it. And that's the basic setup of life, right? That's what he thinks life is. To say that the concept is life is to say that it's the immanent producer of all that is. That's my shorthand definition. It's logical. Whatever this is going to be, the logical sense of life, which we'll have to treat fairly carefully. What does that entail? Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, that's really.
So that's about the best I can do with the violent dimension without being fully, undone.
Yeah.
So look at the beginning lines of the next paragraph down. This is on page 667 now, 170 in the German. He calls it the second sublating of objectivity through objectivity. The second sublating of objectivity through objectivity. So this is, this is the concept realizing itself, but now it realizes itself not in imposition, violent imposition. That's the first sublating, the taking up of it, which is subsumptive. Let's give a name for it. It's subsumptive, right? It's the attempt to subsume objectivity under the concept itself. Here we're not talking about that. We're talking about the determination of objectivity in and through and by the concept. He says, now the second sublating of objectivity through objectivity differs from this first sublation in that the latter, that is the first sublation, being the first, is the purpose in objective immediacy. The second, therefore, is not only the sublating of a first immediacy, but of both, sublating of both moments, right? It shows that they're both moments of one totality. Of the objective as something merely posited, and of the immediate. Something merely posited means it's produced, right? by the concept itself. Now that leads us to this this kind of summary passage we get on page 669, 172 in the journal. And here's another one of those passages where Hegel just literally stops and says, okay, I know we've been about 200 pages. What have we seen? What do I take myself to have shown at this point? And what's been entailed by what we've shown? Always useful overviews from Hegel. Well, we need them. Whether they're terribly useful or not doesn't matter. We have now seen subjectivity. So he's reaching all the way back to the first chapter of the Doctrine of the Concept, right? He's talking about subjectivity. So we've now seen subjectivity. So that's all the stuff about about universal particularity, singularity, judgment, syllogism. We have now seen subjectivity, the being for itself of the concept, pass over into the concept's being in itself, into objectivity. So there's his summary. We've seen how that one pass, we've dealt with the details and the hardships and the difficulties, the challenges of that transition. We've seen that, he said. And then the negativity of that being for itself reassert itself in objectivity. Well, that happened in chemism. Then we've seen it, we've tracked it through into teleology. Teleology is still grappling with this concept relationship to objectivity, but then we see finally at the end that the concept produces objectivity, and therein lies the overcoming of this extrinsicality. He says it reasserts itself in objectivity. The concept has so determined itself in that negativity that its particularity is an external objectivity. Its particularity is not just its own particularization, it's literally the generation of objectivity itself. So I read that to say, it's a pretty amazing claim, right? That the movement of the concept, its particularization of itself, is why we have anything that exists such as that it exists. Literally what he's saying. He then says, or has determined itself as the simple concrete unity whose externality is its self-determination. Self-determination, its freedom. It has generated out of itself objectivity itself. So Hegel thinks at this point that what he's shown is that the concept produces everything. There's nothing outside the concept because there's nothing that exists but the concept's products, its own doings. Everything that is, insofar as it is, and is what it is, so the logic of being, quality, quantity, measure, the logic of essence, all the relations of whole, part, form, content, force, expression, the modal structures, all that stuff is a product of this movement, this process we've seen elaborated in terms of this universality, particularity, singularity, judgment forms, and syllogistic forms. We now actually seen that borne out in and as bringing about objectivity itself. It is being in essence. He says, the movement of purpose, and I'm going to push that line quite a bit now, because when we start talking about the idea, notice he'll always associate purpose with movement. There's never a purpose, like it was separable and distinct from this movement that it is. So Hegel's going to push you pretty hard on what's a Zweck, right? What's a purpose? What's an end? The way we standardly think of it is, something I'm aspiring to, something I want to bring about, right? That's the volitional sense of it. He's saying, actually, no, it designates nothing other than this process. That's all it is. The movement of purpose has now attained this much, namely that the moment of externality is not just posited in the concept, so it's not something that's related to, not something it bears relation to extrinsically. The purpose is not just an ought and a striving. It's not something it's trying to attain, realization. But as a concrete totality is identical with immediate objectivity. It's identical with it. It's not over against it. It is it. And it is the generator, the producer of it. This identity is, on the one hand, the simple concept and the equally immediate objectivity. I don't know how simple it is at this point, but that's what he's saying, is that now we just have the concept into itself, and we have its objectivity there as well. And that's its immediate objectivity. It just is what comes forth from it. It's what it's producing directly. It's not mediated. It doesn't have to climb over and get towards it. It's not got an external realization problem. It's realized directly in it. But on the other hand, so he says it's immediate, right? So that's the line about immediacy. But then he says, but on the other hand, it is just as essentially mediation. Well, where's the mediation coming from? He says. And it is that simple immediacy through this mediation sublating itself as mediation. So the mediation is coming from the concept itself. It mediates itself. It's not something external to it that mediates its relationship to something else external to it, which is what the subjective purpose means objective purpose structure is. Now we're saying literally the means is born within it. So he says, thus the concept is essentially this. Now, I don't know about you, but I need Hegel to tell me every once in a while what he thinks he's shown the concept is. And this is what he does. Right? So at this point, so when we're struggling around as we always do, all of us, right, trying to figure out what in the hell does Hegel mean by the concept. And of course, it means different things at different stages of the demonstration of the argument. Absolutely, it means different things at different stages. But look at what he takes himself. We're getting pretty close to the end, right? We're almost to the idea. The idea is literally everything. So what does he think the concept is here? This is what he says. Thus the concept is essentially this. To be, you have distinguished. Literally, it derives itself, right? Differentiates itself. It differentiates itself as an identity existing for itself from its immediate existent objectivity, and thereby to attain externality, but in this externality to be the totality's self-determining identity. That's just Hegel saying what we've shown is that the concept is nothing other than this movement, this process, that others itself, initially it others itself other than objectivity itself, but then comes to be itself by producing that objectivity. So it's not an identity over against objectivity, it's an identity in and that produces objectivity itself. So he says, but in this external totality, to be the totalities, the external totalities, self-determining identity. Not its immediate identity, not its subsumptive identity, not its inherent identity, but its determining identity. The other term we're about to come back to it that we've used before for this is its genus. It's genus. It's not its subsumptive class. It's not its inherent property. It's its determining genus. We're about to get a lot of that in just a moment. So he says, so the concept is now the idea. Now, I think this is useful in a number of ways. Hegel's about to explore a bunch of them beginning in the next paragraphs, the chapter that you opened, that you read for this week. So I'm going to spend a bit of time there. But if we just stop there and we ask ourselves this question, a question we'll come back to, but let's just ask ourselves initially this question. What's the difference between the concept and the idea? The difference is what the status of the concept is. The concept and the idea are the same thing. Two different names for the same thing, but not at the same stage or status. That's the way I would draw the distinction. So when Hegel says the concept is the idea here, it's momentous because he's literally saying the concept is proven to be not just in objectivity, but to be the determination that produces, the process of determination that produces objectivity. That's what entitles it to the status of now being claimed to be not a concept, not a formal concept like we were looking at in subjectivity, nor a real concept where the concept is submerged in objectivity, but a free, or what he's about to call adequate concept, a concept that's truly adequate, fully expresses its own true nature. It's true to itself. It's in the truth of itself. Hence, the material we'll talk about next week about truth, Hegel's conception of what he means by truth and how the idea is the truth of everything, which is the claim he wants to make. So the idea is the concept, yes, but it's the concept having been shown to be not only formal, but also, let me use terms that Hegel's not using, formal, but also material. And material not in the sense that it is a feature within materiality, and not in the sense in which it subsumes materiality, but formal in the sense that it is what generates materiality itself. I mean materiality in a very broad sense here, not physical matter. We haven't gotten to that yet. That's in the philosophy of nature. But just broadly speaking, the stuff, the saka, as he puts it here, the stuff of the world. At the most basic, fundamental, ontological level, not yet nature, not yet spirit, at the ontological level. Being, qua being. Now, the other thing I want to say about this, let me just take a moment to say, this is why Hegel thinks he can say he's an absolute idealist. This, and only this, is why he thinks he can say he's an absolute idealist. Because idealism doesn't mean, for him, mind-dependent. If I go back to Berkeley, good old modern philosophy, and I say Berkeley is an idealist, we all go, yep, yep. Why? Because he thinks that everything's predicated on being mind-dependent. There is no existence of anything outside of mind-dependence. Oh, well, then how do we know if there's some, tree falls in the forest that makes a noise if there's no one around to observe it? No problem, says Berkeley. God. Right? God is the ultimate mind upon which everything is dependent. So we can talk about a subjective idealism. We can talk about a God idealism in that sense in Berkeley. All that's wonderful, makes sense. But all that's predicated on the idea that idea means mind dependency. And Hegel's saying, it's quite often, concept and idea are not mental properties, they're not mental objects, they're not mental things. Of course, we use the terms that way. Of course, we say, I have an idea, and we mean a thought in our minds. Oftentimes we mean I have a picture in my mind, I have a mental image in my mind of what I want, to happen. I have an idea. Or I have a notion, right? We'll say that, we mean an idea. We'll use those terms like that. We use concept like that, right? I mean, we in the Hegel world know that that's not how Hegel's using the term concept. And what obviously I'm telling you is we in Hegel world know that that's not how he's using idea either. So when he says the concept is idea, he's saying everything is what it is by virtue of the process that we call the concept. And what does it do? It differentiates itself, others itself, particularizes itself, and thereby everything is by virtue of that process of differentiation. Well, that's the idea. Once you've established that that is this, but not before this. Only once the concept has proven itself to be not only in objectivity, but the producer of objectivity within objectivity itself, can you then say that the concept is idea. And then idea means that. It means the concept has this status of being literally that which engenders, produces, let me use the term very generically, causes everything from itself. So Hegel can then say, I'm an idealist. And you'll hear him in our vernacular and say, oh, that means everything's mind dependent. It's dependent on our minds, Hegel. Our recognitive structures we build with one another and we recognize things that, no, says Hegel. Oh, well, then you mean God is, everything's dependent on God. We're kind of, Berkeleyan idealists in that sense, or, some kind of reformed Leibnizians about the matter. God is, holds all the possible worlds. And so, no, says Hegel. I mean by that exactly what I said. The concept is in reality and is the producer of reality. That's what it means when it's an idea. It is the idea. And everything's predicated on that. So everything is idea dependent because the concept produces. Now, the interesting thing here, interesting maybe only to those of us who are trying to track these things in this period, it's here, finally, what are we, 670 pages into this book in English, that Hegel will go back and say, you know what? That subject-object thing, which Schelling was enamored of, that's right. I'm sorry, I thought that was the night in which all cows were black. Right? That's what he called it Hegel called it that in the introduction, famously to the preface of the Phenomenology, right, famously. And, it's what got him and, there's the signal, right? It's the red flag of I'm breaking from Schelling, of Hegel emerging as his own philosopher at that moment and saying, I'm no longer beholden to that. But 670 pages into his major work, right? Outside the encyclopedia, his major work, he says, you know what? The subject-object thing was right. But clearly, it's right. Subjectivity and objectivity are one, where the subjectivity generates the objectivity. That's literally a summation of what he just said. The concept generates everything. The subjective concept, formal concept generates all things. But he thinks he's entitled to it. Schelling didn't have any entitlement to it. This is Hegel's talking about Schelling. That when Schelling says the truth of everything is subject-object. So take a look at, this is on, yeah, this is on page 673, 176 in the German. As oftentimes, right, at the beginning of these sections, he's reviewing where he's gotten to, how he got here, and giving you kind of the quick overview of how things came to be this way, and then what the results of that are. And he does that again here. But look on 673, about midway down the page, he says, now the idea has shown itself to be the concept liberated again. Where through I'm at? Right, about midway down that page, 176 in the German. Now the idea has shown itself to be the concept liberated again into its subjectivity. It's a weird phrase. In German, it's a weird phrase in English. Liberated into, usually you're liberated from. Right? You're not freed from here, you're freed into. What does that mean? It means that we've seen the concept come into its own as free, not over against objectivity, but in objectivity. Liberated into its subjectivity from the immediacy into which it has sunk in the object. There's that language again. The concept sunk, submerged in objectivity. It is the concept that differentiates itself, right? Distinguishes itself, literally differentiates itself from its objectivity, but an objectivity which is no less determined by it and possesses its substantiality only in that concept. So there's the moment we've been talking about at the end of teleology, where you can't get the realization of the concept in objectivity unless the concept produced both. So he says, this identity has therefore rightly been designated as a subject-object. This is, come on, this is him 670 pages into this major work saying, Schelling's term was appropriate, but Schelling didn't have the right to it. Why? Because Schelling hadn't answered the quid juris question and hadn't answered the ontological question more fundamentally. He hadn't told us, how could you know this? How could you know that the truth of everything is subject-object? And he hadn't actually shown that it was the case. So deficient in two respects, according to Hegel. Right term. Remember, Hegel for several years was a full-blown Schellingian. Right? He signed on to what his younger compatriot was saying, and he said, I'm all for that. This is brilliant. We're going down this road. We're both absolute idealists. We're not subjective idealists like the Fichte and his crowd are. We've actually found the objective, full-blown absolute idealism. That's the route we're going down. And the centerpiece of all that is what? Identity, unity, identity of identity and difference. These are all formulations. Or, subject-object. Hegel's coming back to this and saying, wait a minute. The phenomenology is an argument that we have the right to have that kind of insight, not just, we don't just gain it through, as Schelling said we did, and as Hegel originally said we did, intellectual intuition. So this moment we've seen, talked about earlier, much earlier in the class, where we talked about this deriving from Hölderlin, right? Hölderlin would say you have to grasp that through immediate intellectual intuition. Hölderlin calls that aesthetic intuition. Schelling picks it up and traces it back to intellectual intuition, which you already have in Kant and earlier, obviously, it's in Eckhart. But what are you grasping in that intellectual intuition? Well, for Schelling, you grasp that everything is one. Everything is one means subject-object is the fundamental. Hegel's saying, well, first of all, what's the epistemology? Can't be intellectual intuition. We've got to show that we can actually have knowledge of the absolute, absolute knowing, which is what the phenomenology lays out for us. There's your first route into the science of logic. But we also know you can get there by setting aside all presuppositions, abstract all commitments, extract yourself from all commitments. Where would you also be? The absolute, subject-object. But have you established that the subject-object is the right way of understanding the nature of reality? Not at that point, you haven't. All you can say at that point is, as he does at the beginning of the book, being is. That's all you're entitled to at that point. Absolute knowing's first proclamation, its first bit of knowledge that it can proclaim, that it can assert, is being is. But of course, that's vacuous. So being turns out to be nothing. And nothing is, so nothing turns out to be being. And really they are one transitioning into the other. So that's becoming. We know the whole story, and it then ends up here. But of course, all of this is what's required in order to establish the subject-object claim. So he says, this identity has therefore rightly been designated as a subject-object, for it is just as well the formal or subjective concept. The formal, right, we now know is what? Universality, particularity, singularity, the judgment forms, syllogistic forms. As it is the object of such mechanism, chemism, teleology. But this is a point that needs further precision. I'll endorse my former mentor's language for this only after we've earned it epistemologically and ontologically. He never gave us either. That's the assertion against Schelling. But this is a point that needs further precision. So here's where Hegel's now going to try to be more precise about what the ultimate idea, subject, object, they all mean the same thing, what it really is. He says, the concept, inasmuch as it has truly attained its reality, so it is fully realized, is this absolute judgment, Urteil, separation of itself, right? Originary separation, whose subject distinguishes or differentiates itself as self-relating negative unity from its objectivity, and is the latter's being in and for itself. Well, there's the concept stood over against objectivity. But he says, it relates to it, objectivity, essentially through itself, and is therefore self-directed, self-governing, self-directing purpose and impulse. Svek, he's going back and getting that notion now where it's a self-svek. It's a svek that literally generates from itself, its own self. It's self-causative. And he calls it a trieb. Impulse, that's what you're getting translated as trieb. He then says, for this very reason, however, the subject does not possess objectivity immediately in it, not subsumptive. It would then be only the totality of the object as such, a totality lost in the objectivity. There's Hegel's rejection of class membership as the way to think about universality. But is the realization of the purpose. Okay, the realization of the purpose. That's what we were trying to get in extrinsic teleology. So how have we solved that problem? He tells you, an objectivity posited by virtue of the activity of the purpose. Posited here clearly means produced. One which as positiveness, so objectivity qua positiveness, as produced by the concept, has its subsistence and its form only as permeated by its subject, which is the concept. He then rehearses this, right? Goes back through this one more time. As objectivity, it has the moment of the externality of the concept in it, and is in general, therefore, the side of finitude, of alteration and appearance. But this side retreats into the negative unity of the concept, and there it perishes. The negativity whereby its indifferent externality of being manifests itself as unessential, as a positiveness is the concept itself. It is what the concept is engendered, what it has produced. Look down at the next paragraph, and this one I want to focus on for just a few minutes before we launch into what's the stuff about the logical concept of the idea. So he's just said it's right to call the idea subject-object. And after that he said, but we need more precision about this. So he rehearses, right, what he's demonstrated in the doctrine of the concept of the subjective logic. And notice the cornerstone of that is this relationship, initially an extrinsic relationship of the concept and objectivity, then ultimately the concept producing objectivity from within itself. So there's the more precision, right? And that renders objectivity, he says, unessential and transitory, because what's more fundamental is the concept itself, which is produced. But then look at what he does at 674, 177 in the German. Paragraph begins, this yields the following closer determinations of the idea. Now, I'll just confess something here. I'm always flabbergasted when people are talking about Hegel and what he means by the idea and all these other kinds of things, or what he means by the concept, and they don't go to these passages. right? Because here's Hegel telling you, more precisely as he's saying, these determine whether they're helpful or not, is a whole other matter. But at least he's given you his account of what he thinks the concept, the idea, subject object is. Look what he says here. First, the idea is the simple truth, the identity of concept and objectivity as a universal in which the opposition, the presence of the particular, is dissolved in its self-identical negativity and is equal with itself. Well, that's Hegel terminology at this point for universality particularizes itself and thereby becomes singular. That's the logical structure of that process. So that's the first determination of it. Then he gives you a second. It is the connection of the subjectivity of the simple concept existing for itself and of the concept's objectivity, which is differentiated from it. The former, that is the subjectivity, is essentially the impulse to sublate this separation. Tree. So he's taking that term, the impulse to sublate. That's how you need to understand Zweck. That's how you need to understand concept. That's how you need to understand purpose. It's an impulse to sublate. We'll get a different understanding of it in just a moment. It'll differentiate. It's the impulse to differentiate. And he says, and the latter, objectivity, is indifferent positiveness. Subsistence, which is in and for itself, is null. As this connection, the idea is, so now we've talked about it as a relation, right? So first of all, as a logical structure, then as a relation. Then finally he says, as this connection, the idea is the process. There's his term, right? Hegel's favorite term for the concept as subject-object, as the idea, is to call it a process. A process of what, he says? A process of disrupting itself, differentiating itself, deriving itself is literally what it says in German. Into individuality, into singularity. And into the latter's inorganic nature, and in them bringing this inorganic nature again under the controlling power of the subject and back to the first simple universality. Well, as we're about to find out, that's life. So you could say, we can now have a bunch of equatable terms. The concept is the idea when the concept's been shown to be not just subjective, not just formal, and not just real, but to be that which generates reality itself. So now we've got it as the idea. It's adequate to itself, so it's the adequate concept. All those are interchangeable. That's the idea. The idea is the subject-object. What's the more precise determination of the subject-object? Well, it's this logical structure of universality particularizing itself into singularity. Yeah. That means that it also has a relationship between subjectivity and objectivity, so there's a relation between the two, where it engenders, the former, subjectivity engenders, creates, constitutes the latter, objectivity. So it's a relation. But the ultimate way to talk about it is a process of differentiation. Life process. That's what he's about to call it. Then he says, the identity of the idea with itself is one with the process. I love that because it's one of these points where Hegel's just trying to, in my view, trying to be crystal clear. I didn't say it's like a process. Right? I didn't say you could, metaphorically figure it that way. I'm saying it is. The identity of the idea with itself is one with the process. The thought that liberates actuality from the seeming of purposeless mutability and transfigures it into idea must not represent, it does not depict, this truth of actuality as dead repose, dead rest, right? Something just merely asleep into it. Oh, we made it to the idea. The idea is everything, right? And the idea is this kind of dead thing unto itself. Absolutely not. As a mere picture, numb, without impulsive movement. We've just been told that it is nothing other than impulsive movement. As a genius or number, I take those to be other, these are all historical references, right? So genius is a reference to Kant or Schiller, number is a reference back to Pythagoras. You can do all the historical reference points here if you want to. All of them he's trying to say is, look, in the history of philosophy, they've all tried to talk about this. And when they try to talk about this, they gesture at it, they figure at it, they represent it. They depict it as something dead. The ultimate number, the one. Pythagoras. The genius who creates the work of art, right? Well, both Schiller and Kant think it's the genius who does this, right? Well, how to do it? It flows out of them. But the genius then stands over against them and resides within them, this kind of work of nature that happens in them. The technique of nature happens in them. They express it this way. He says, or as an abstract thought. This is the way we standardly conceive of it. That's an indictment of Platonism and everything else. Abstract thought. The idea, so just to go back, he's reasserting this now. The idea, because of the freedom which the concept has attained in it, also has the most stubborn, the most harsh opposition within it. It's not at rest. It's not in equilibrium. It's not at peace. It's beset by differentiation because it's nothing other than differentiation itself. Its repose, right? Its rest, its ruah, its rest, stability, consists in the assurance and the certainty with which it eternally generates that opposition and eternally overcomes it, and in it rejoins itself. Now there's, if you want to know what Hegel thinks is the ultimate nature of reality, he just gave it to you. Is that it others itself, and in that othering of itself, it comes to be itself. I just said. So it's not a dead repose, right? Hegel is a thinker of movement, a thinker of fluidity. And it's not a fluidity that just, happens like it happens, a pure spontaneity, unable to be accounted for in any kind of rationalistic structures. It is a rationally law-governed process by which everything is what it is. Now, we'll take a break here just a second, but let me set up the discussion of life, discussion of the life section this way. Hegel, if you look at the next paragraph down, says, but the idea is at first again only immediate. That's Hegel for, I just told you everything, but we're not at everything yet. So this is Hegel saying, I think I just said everything. Because he did. He just literally said, everything is this movement of the process of the concept that we can now call the idea, that is now the subject-object process of differentiation. There it is. It's what he thinks we're entitled to call it. He says, but we're not there just yet. Why aren't we there? I mean, we are and we aren't there. We are there because we've now seen that the purpose has to be within objectivity itself. And that must generate all that objectivity is. And he's going to name that the life process. The life process. But that's not the end of the matter, because that will also be self-reflexive. It'll turn back upon itself. And he'll call that cognition. Okay, Kevin, I'm a little confused. Sounds like we were talking about the idea, which is a mental thing, and now we're talking about cognition, which is a mental process. Nope. Cognition names an ontological process before it names an epistemic, cognitive process. Mental process. And then we'll end this discussion by talking about the absolute idea, that is the absolute truth. There's the structure of the chapter. Now, just a word about this, then let me set it up this way. A couple words here. First, when he says on 675, so he's laying out the chapter, division of the chapter between life, cognition, and absolute idea. He says in this is the last paragraph down there at the bottom of 675, this is 178 in the German. Third, spirit recognizes, or knows, the idea as its absolute truth. That's where we're ultimately headed, is absolute truth. As a truth that is in and for itself, the infinite idea in which cognizing and doing are equalized. We'll talk about why cognition has these two moments, right? Cognition is not just knowing, but it's also doing. And which is the absolute knowledge of itself. Well, we ended the phenomenology with absolute knowing, but it wasn't there self-reflexive. It wasn't absolute knowing that had knowledge of itself. So the other term he's going to use for that is method. Method. Now, we'll take this up over the course of the next couple of sessions, but here let me just, note for you how wrong that sounds. Method doesn't come last. Everyone knows that, right? Method comes first. We put it right at the front of things, right? Rules for the direction of the mind, said Descartes. You need to know the rules for the direction of the mind before you start, using your mind to, like meditate and think about how, this whole world could be a crazy illusion produced by some hyperbolic evil demon. But you need rules for the direction of the mind before you get going. Spinoza did the same thing, right? Spinoza has a little tract it's not in the Ethics. It's a little tract called what's it called? Emendations for the intellect, right? And there, it's another tract on method. How do you perceive to know things? It's a little epistemology tract. In that sense, in a classic sense, we get this from Aristotle, right? Aristotle is the one who told us that you need the organon. The organon has the posterior and the all that, and the anterior. All that stuff becomes before you start doing the actual work of thinking. And Hegel's put method at the end. So he's obviously had a mistake here, right? Method goes first. No, actually, says Hegel. Method comes last. Now there is a precedent for this. Right? It's not the same thing, but there is a precedent for this. Where does methodology come in the first critique for Kant? At the end. Right? The methodology section in the first critique comes at the end. Why? Because only after you've demonstrated, for Kant now, only after you've established what the boundaries of knowability are, can you start talking about how you would know things. Methodology, how, modos, methodos. How do you proceed along the pathway of knowing? Well, Hegel's not engaged in an epistemological project here. He's engaged in an ontological project. So what's this got to do? Why is method coming last for him? Method comes last for him because method is the self-reflective moment by which the idea comes to be rendered explicit, and you can now know what the way of things formation is in and of itself, and therefore how you ought to think about things. As we'll talk about in one of our final sessions, right? Hegel thinks that epistemology follows ontology. Epistemology follows ontology. Well, it's kind of paradoxical because it does and it doesn't. We'll talk more about that when we get there. But if you want to know what does Hegel think of as the proper way to know things, and Hegel will say to you, oh, well, once we've reached this point, the proper way to know things is to know things in their truth. Well, right, but how do I get there? I just spent 670 pages showing you what things are in their truth. So follow that out, my friends. That's what knowing things properly, knowing them in their truth, that's what the method, the absolute method, would have to be. So he says right at the beginning of the final chapter, the third chapter in this division section of the book, final chapter, he says, the concept is everything. That's really all I've argued for in this book. The concept is everything. Right. That's what we've seen. Now, once that's established, he says, you can know then how to know things. You can have absolute knowledge of knowledge itself. You can know what it is to know things absolutely self-reflexively. You can know what the methodology finally is. So, as you've heard me say several times, there is no method to the science of logic. There is no method in the sense of, okay, what's the rules for the direction of the mind that we're following to get from one step to the next? Follow out the imminent development from one to the next. You remain imminent. You see what it takes you necessarily, only where it takes you necessarily, not where it takes you arbitrarily, but where it takes you necessarily. You follow that unpacking of that out to its nth degree and all the crevices and details that puts you in. That's what it is to follow the imminent development of the concept itself. But at the end of that, you can see, oh, wait a minute, reflexively, that means that if everything is that movement, then to know everything in its truth is to know it in accordance with that movement. What else would be the nature of anything that's real? Now that's where we'll get to with method, right? Method at the end of this book. It's kind of anticlimactic for a lot of people because they get there and they want to say, oh, well, here's where we get the big, announcement about, what the absolute is. Well, we've already got the absolute. Subject object is the absolute. Process is the absolute. If you were confused by that, that last paragraph on 674, where it has, it can't be represented as a dead repose. That's a flourish for Hegel to say, what I'm trying to articulate as the foundation of everything, the truth of everything, is this process. But he says, at first we only have that immediate. We only have it as life, he says. Now, here's the setup, and we'll take a break after this. What the hell is life doing in the logic? Absolutely legitimate question, right? Many of the other things we've been through here you really couldn't ask that question about. Of course they belong, right? Actuality, yeah, if you're doing ontology, you got to talk about actuality. Form, okay, yeah, I have to talk about form. Being, yeah, I have to talk about being. Existence, yeah, it belongs here. All that seems pretty much part and parcel, belongs in this domain. The logic stuff, okay, the judgments, I don't know. The syllogisms, I don't know. But, you can make a case that, oh, no, that's what the formal concept is these structures. So it's the structure of the process. So we're not talking, formal logic for formal logic's sake, as we know. We're talking about formal logic only so far as it uncovers, articulates the movement of the concept of the process, the concept that is the process itself. Okay, fine. I'll even buy that now. So then you've got this mechanism, chemism. Yeah, that's weird. It's a weird sense of mechanism because it's not mechanism in the natural sense. It's not chemism, whatever that would be in the natural sense. It's a different usage of those terms, right? It's an ontological usage, but okay, I'll take those. But life, really? Life is a natural thing. Life is arguably not just a natural thing. It is at least a natural thing, but it's a feature of the natural world. Some things are alive. Aristotle famously said, some things are animated, some things aren't. The ones that are animated are organic, the ones that aren't are inorganic. Welcome to my beginning of a differentiation between all the things that exist in the world. But that's the natural world. It gives itself as categoralizable into these various different genre and species, as we'll talk about later. But Hegel's saying, yeah, life, I know, I understand life is natural. I get that. And then, Hegel will want to say, life is not just natural, it's also spiritual. It's a category in the philosophy of spirit as well. So when Hegel poses this question, what the hell, I'm paraphrasing, what the hell does logic have to do with life? He knows that it doesn't look like it belongs here. In fact, he says, take a look at what he says on page 677. Or just back up, let's do this other passage, 676, right at the beginning of the life chapter. He says, the idea of life has to do with a subject matter so concrete. I mean, we've not been dealing with anything concrete. Yes? Right? This is our frustration with the logic. Nothing terribly concrete here. All of it, abstractions galore. The idea of life has to do with a subject matter so concrete, if you will, so real, that in dealing with it, one may seem, according to the common notion of logic, to have overstepped its boundaries. Now that's Hegel's version of basically saying, okay, you've gone too far now. Come on. This is too much. Needless to say, if the logic were to contain nothing but empty, dead forms of thought, then there could be no talk in it at all of such a content as the idea or life. Well, we have to concede that's at this point. Hegel's main point has been what? The concept is process. So, as he says here, it's not an empty, dead form of thought. It is, at least metaphorically, alive, animated. Let's use those terms for the moment, cautiously, right? Because they still can be imported. Right? They don't belong in the logic, but they're imported from the natural world. He says, but if the subject matter of logic is the absolute truth, and truth as such lies essentially in cognition, then cognition at least would have to come in for consideration. It is common practice to have the so-called pure logic be followed by an applied logic. So we've been doing pure logic. We'll get over to the applied stuff later. A logic that has to do with concrete cognition, quite apart from all the psychology and anthropology. This is the way Kant divides general logic up from pure logic up from applied logic. It is commonly deemed necessary to interpolate into logic. But the anthropological and psychological side of cognition is concerned with the form in which cognition appears when the concept does not as yet have an objectivity and equal to it. That is, when it does not as yet have itself as object. Now that's loaded because we do have the concept as objectivity. It does have itself as object, where we're at. The part of the logic that deals with this concrete cognition does not belong to applied logic as such. If it did, then every science would have to be dragged into logic, for each is an applied logic insofar as it consists in apprehending its subject matter in forms of thought and concepts. So everything's applied logic at that point. Then he says, the subjective concept has presuppositions that are exhibited in psychological, anthropological, and other forms. But the presuppositions of the pure concept, which is the one he's talking about, belong in logic only to the extent that they have the form of pure thoughts. So now we're raising the bar up, right? We're not going to be talking about life as a concrete natural phenomenon, not life as a concrete spiritual phenomenon. It has to have the form of pure thoughts of abstract essentialities, such as are the determinations of being in essence. We can't, fall out of that. We have to stay at the level of that we are dealing with things at the level of being in essence. The same goes for cognition, which in the concept's comprehension of itself, no other shape of its presupposition, but the one which is itself idea is to be dealt with in the logic. This, however, is a presupposition which is necessarily treated in logic. This presupposition is now the immediate idea. So what we've taken for granted there, namely life, is going to actually be dealt with in the logic itself, and must be. For while cognition is the concept insofar as the latter exists for itself, but as a subjectivity relating to an objectivity, then the concept relates to the idea as presupposed or as immediate, but the immediate idea just is life itself. Now, he owes us a lot more explanation. He's going to spend a couple pages trying to do that. And what he's going to try to do is differentiate life in three senses. Life in three senses. Life is a natural phenomenon. Life is a spiritual phenomenon. And life is a logical concept. So natural life, spiritual life, logical life. The first two have some, intuitive plausibility. I've seen things that are alive in the natural world. I've met other human beings in the spiritual, let's say broadly human world. And, you guys look alive, some less so, some more so. Okay. But you all look alive at this point. I haven't lost anybody. Okay, good. So we know what that is in the spiritual domain. We know what that is, what life is in the natural domain. But what could it possibly be in the logical domain? Here's the real trick. Right? Hegel's already set this up this way. It can't be the case, and we're going to hold him to this, because this is going to be a problem for him. It can't be the case that we interpolate from the natural and the spiritual the things we want to put into the logical. We can't go borrowing, go look ahead to the philosophy of nature and go, oh, this is what an organism does. I'm going to put that over here. In the science of logic, because I said the concept is process, it's the life process. So, I know what a living thing is in the natural world, I know what living things are in the spiritual world, I'll just import those back. No, that would be a non-immanent demonstration. So his account of life, sensibility, irritability, and reproduction, can't be borrowed from those other domains. And you're going to say, but of course, Kevin, they are. Because if you go and look at the philosophy of nature and you look at its account of the life process, the natural life process, strangely enough, it's got sensibility, irritability, and reproduction. And if you go and look at it in the spiritual side, there's variations of that same threefold structure. Hegel's aware of that. He's not an idiot. He thinks there is a difference. What is the difference that makes all the difference? Well, we'll have to see. We have to see what his claim is about that, how that works, so that we can have if we can have, a logical concept of life over and distinct from, but related to, right? But not the same thing as natural life, and over and distinct from, but nonetheless related to spiritual sense of life. Let me take a break there, come back, and we'll talk about this on our way into life itself. It's 4:30. Let's be back at 4:40, and then we'll figure out life.